The Hells Angels biker found the little girl crying beside a fallen veteran's cabin, and saving her forced him to rise again. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. It was a cold winter evening when Jake Reaper Morrison, a weathered Hells Angels biker, was riding down the snow-covered roads of Northern California. The wind howled in his ears, but he didn't mind. The rumble of his Harley was a comforting companion, one that drowned out the chaos inside his head. He had long since learned to embrace the solitude of the road, to distance himself from the memories of his past, and to shut down anything that threatened his peace. He had been to war and back, lost brothers, and seen things most men could not imagine. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. As he made his way through a narrow path in the forest, a faint sound broke through the constant hum of his bike. It was almost drowned by the wind, but it was there. A child's cry, weak and distant, as though it was a call for help. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't used to hearing such cries, not on the open road, and certainly not in the middle of nowhere. He slowed his bike, squinting through the fog of the night, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. He parked his bike in a small clearing and dismounted, the cold biting through his leather jacket. He paused for a moment, listening closely. The cry was louder now, more distinct. It came from a cabin in the distance, a decrepit structure that looked as though it hadn't been lived in for years. Jake's instincts screamed at him to walk away, to keep riding, but something in him resisted. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't supposed to get involved. But the sound of a child in distress was something he couldn't ignore. With a deep breath, he made his way toward the cabin. As he drew closer, the cry grew more frantic. He reached the cabin and peeked around the corner. There, huddled by the front steps, was a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 6 or 7, her face streaked with tears, her clothes tattered and soaked from the snow. Her small frame shivered uncontrollably as she curled into herself, seeking warmth that wasn't there. The sight struck him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't the road he usually walked. He was a biker, a warrior, a man of few words and fewer emotions. But this was different. He knelt down beside her, his large frame looming over her, and spoke in the gentlest voice he could muster. "Hey kid, are you okay?" She looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes, her body trembling. I'm scared," she stammered, barely able to speak through the sobs. Jake's heart clenched. The last thing he expected to see was a vulnerable child, alone in the snow, looking up at him with fear. He reached out, trying to offer comfort, but the girl flinched. She had been abandoned, and anyone who looked like Jake, with tattoos and a rough exterior, probably didn't inspire much trust. But Jake wasn't going to leave her there. He gently placed his hand on her shoulder and spoke softly. "You're safe now. I won't hurt you. Let's get you somewhere warm." The little girl's eyes searched his face, her expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Slowly, she nodded, her small body still shaking with cold. Jake picked her up carefully, holding her against his chest, and turned to head back to his bike. As he made his way through the snow, he couldn't help but think about how this moment felt like a turning point, the kind of thing he'd never thought he'd experience. Saving this little girl had forced him to confront the parts of himself he had buried for so long. He had always kept his distance from the world, from any human connection, but this child's innocent cry had broken through the walls he had built around his heart. It was time for him to rise again. As Jake carefully carried the little girl back to his Harley, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into something much bigger than he had ever anticipated. The snow was falling heavier now, covering the ground in a thick, white blanket. The cold air bit at his skin, but it didn't bother him much. His mind was preoccupied with the child in his arms. He had never been good with kids. In fact, the only reason he had kept a distance from people for so long was because he didn't know how to deal with emotions, his own or anyone else's. But this little girl, her trembling body against his chest, the way she clung to him as though he were the only thing standing between her and total despair, it stirred something deep inside him. He had always prided himself on being tough, on never needing anyone. But now, as he walked through the snow, The weight of her small form was a reminder that maybe, just maybe, he had lost his way somewhere along the road. He reached his bike and gently placed her on the seat, carefully making sure she was secure. The little girl's eyes, wide and full of uncertainty, met his. "Are you okay?" Jake asked softly. She nodded, but her lips trembled. "I'm just cold," she whispered. Jake looked around. The cabin she had been huddled near was barely visible through the snow. He had to get her somewhere warm. Without hesitation, he started the engine, the deep rumble of the Harley filling the air. He revved the engine once before taking off down the road. The wind and snow slapped against them, but Jake kept his focus on the road ahead. As they rode, the little girl nestled closer to him, her small arms wrapping around his waist. It wasn't until they were a few miles down the road that she spoke again, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. "My name is Lily," she said, her words shaky. Jake glanced over his shoulder, catching her gaze. "Lily," he repeated, as if tasting the name. "How old are you, Lily?" She hesitated, but then answered, 7. Jake's heart tightened. 7. He could barely remember a time when he had been that young, and certainly not a time when he had felt safe. He was struck by the thought that a child so young had been forced to endure such hardship. Lily's voice brought him out of his thoughts. "I was living with my grandpa," she said, her voice quieter now. "But he's gone now." Jake felt a pang in his chest, but he didn't say anything. He had learned long ago that words often didn't help. He just rode, letting the road and the wind work their magic. They eventually reached a small, run-down motel on the outskirts of town. Jake parked the bike and helped Lily off, leading her inside. The room was small, but it had a bed and a heater, which was all he could ask for. As soon as the door closed behind them, Lily went straight for the bed and collapsed onto it, curling up under the covers. Jake pulled a chair up next to her, watching her carefully. She was exhausted, that much was clear. He hadn't realized just how much this little girl had been through. The fact that she had been so alone, so vulnerable, in the middle of a snowstorm, spoke volumes. She had no one else to turn to. He felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He had always prided himself on his independence, his ability to handle everything on his own. But now, as he sat there, watching this little girl slowly drift off to sleep, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He wasn't sure what had happened to Lily's family, but he knew that he wasn't going to let her down. Not now, not ever. He'd seen too much in his life to ignore the fact that sometimes the world wasn't as cold and heartless as it seemed. Sometimes there was room for redemption. Jake stayed up for hours, watching over her, lost in his own thoughts. His past, his choices, the club, everything seemed so far away now. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this. But one thing was clear. Saving Lily had already begun to change him. He had always been running from his past, from the things he'd done, from the people he'd hurt. But as he sat there, protecting this innocent child, something inside him began to shift. Maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to face the man he had become and find a way to rise again. The next morning, the sound of the heater humming softly in the corner was the only noise in the small, dimly lit motel room. Jake sat in the chair by the window, his eyes watching the snow falling steadily outside. It was a quiet, peaceful moment, but inside him, things were anything but calm. He glanced over at Lily, still curled up under the blankets on the bed. Her small form was barely visible under the covers, but the rise and fall of her chest told him that she was still asleep. He wasn't sure what to do next. He had never been one to take responsibility for anyone. He had lived his life for himself, and the idea of being tied down to another person, especially a child, was something he hadn't planned for. But as he sat there, watching Lily sleep, he couldn't ignore the fact that something had changed. He had saved her from the cold, but now he felt like he had been saved as well. His rough exterior, his life as a Hell's Angels enforcer, had all been about survival. But now, as he stared at the little girl in the bed, he realized that surviving was no longer enough. He had to figure out what came next. It wasn't until Lily stirred and sat up, rubbing her eyes, that he was pulled back to the present. She looked up at him, her big brown eyes still filled with confusion and uncertainty. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't have an answer. What was he supposed to do now? He had no family, no friends left to turn to. The Hell's Angels had been his family, But that life had crumbled away years ago. He had pushed everyone away, and now he was left with a child he barely knew, unsure of what to do next. "I don't know, kid," Jake replied honestly. "But we're going to figure it out." The words felt strange coming out of his mouth, but he meant them. He knew he couldn't just leave her. He couldn't leave her out in the cold again, alone. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt something that resembled hope. Maybe he could help her, just like he had helped her last night. Maybe this was his chance to do something right for once. They spent the rest of the morning together, Lily sitting at the small table in the corner of the room, while Jake rummaged through his bag for some food. He wasn't much of a cook, but he had a few snacks that would keep them going for now. He handed her a granola bar and a bottle of water, and watched as she ate, her eyes darting nervously from side to side. Jake could tell she wasn't used to being in a safe place. "Thank you for helping me," Lily said quietly, looking up at him with gratitude. Jake just nodded, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't used to being thanked for anything. He had done what anyone would do, what anyone should do. But for some reason, her words made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Worthwhile. They finished their breakfast in silence, and after a few more minutes of sitting in the room, Jake knew it was time to go. He couldn't stay here forever. Lily needed a place to stay, something permanent, and Jake wasn't sure he was the right person to provide it. But he couldn't just leave her. Not after everything she had been through. "We're going to figure this out, all right?" Jake said, standing up and walking over to Lily. "But we can't stay here. We need to find somewhere safe, somewhere you can stay for good." Lily looked up at him, her small face full of uncertainty. "Where will we go?" she asked. Jake didn't know the answer to that question, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to give up on her. For the first time in years, Jake had a purpose. He wasn't just riding on the road to escape. He wasn't just hiding from the past anymore. He had something to fight for now. He had someone to protect. He helped Lily gather her things and wrapped her up in her coat before walking her out to the bike. The snow was still falling, but it didn't seem as cold as it had the night before. Jake revved the engine, and Lily climbed on behind him, her small arms wrapped around his waist. As they drove through the snow-covered roads, Jake's mind was racing. He didn't know where they would go, or how he would protect her. But he did know this. He wasn't alone anymore. And that, for the first time in years, made all the difference. The ride through the snow-covered roads felt longer than it should have, the wind biting at their faces as Jake and Lily made their way to an uncertain future. Jake tried to focus on the road ahead, the engine of the Harley humming beneath him, but his mind kept drifting back to the little girl holding on to him. She was still clinging to his back, her arms wrapped around his waist as though she were afraid to let go. He could feel the tension in her small body, her body shaking not just from the cold, but from something deeper. He knew she had been through a lot, more than any child should have to endure. Her silent presence behind him was a constant reminder of the weight of responsibility he now carried. It wasn't just about keeping her safe anymore. It was about giving her something he hadn't given himself in years: hope. They reached a small town a couple of hours later, the snowstorm still swirling around them, making the streets look eerily empty. Jake slowed the bike down as they passed the small motels and shops. He could see the unease in Lily's eyes as she looked out over the town. She wasn't sure where they were going, and to be honest, Jake wasn't sure either. He had no plan, no idea what was next. But he knew he couldn't leave her out in the cold again, not after everything she had been through. He parked the bike in front of a small diner, the warm light spilling out from the windows. It was a typical small-town diner, the kind that had a few regulars and not much else. Jake removed his helmet and helped Lily off the bike. She looked up at him with a mixture of curiosity and fear, unsure of what would come next. "We're going inside to get warm," Jake said, trying to sound reassuring. "You'll be okay, kid." Lily nodded but didn't say anything. Jake could see the trust in her eyes, but he also saw the wariness that was still there. She was used to being let down, and it wasn't going to be easy for her to believe that things could be different now. As they walked inside, the warmth of the diner hit them both. The smell of coffee and fried food filled the air, and Jake couldn't help but feel a small sense of comfort. It had been a long time since he had been in a place like this. The atmosphere was calm, almost homey, with old wooden booths and a few people scattered around, minding their own business. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with short brown hair, smiled as they walked in. "Hey there, what can I get for you?" she asked. Jake paused for a moment, glancing at Lily, who had her head down, still holding onto his jacket. "Just some coffee for me," Jake said, his voice gruff. He wasn't used to asking for anything. But Lily needed something more. "Do you have any hot chocolate?" he asked, looking down at her. Lily looked up at him, a small spark of hope in her eyes. "Yes," the waitress replied, her smile growing. "We've got hot chocolate. I'll get you both something right away." Jake nodded and sat down at a booth, making sure Lily was comfortable before sitting across from her. The waitress soon brought over their drinks, Jake's coffee and a steaming mug of hot chocolate for Lily. As she handed it to the little girl, the warmth seemed to bring a little color back to her pale cheeks. Lily wrapped her small hands around the mug, looking up at Jake. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake didn't respond at first. Instead, he watched her, the weight of the last few days pressing down on him. He had saved her from the cold, but now he realized that the cold wasn't just outside. It was inside of him too. He had buried his emotions for so long, but now, with Lily here, he could feel something breaking through the walls he had built. This wasn't just about protecting her anymore. It was about redemption, about finding a way to rise again, not just for her, but for himself too. As they sat in silence, the weight of their situation settled in. Jake had no idea what would happen next. But as he looked at Lily, he knew he couldn't leave her alone in this world. She had no one else, and he wasn't about to be the one to walk away. For the first time in years, Jake felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living for something greater than himself. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He was going to keep fighting for her. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough too. Give them both a second chance. The sun had set by the time Jake and Lily left the diner, the sky now a blanket of deep purple with streaks of orange fading into the horizon. The cold had returned, sharp and biting, but it didn't seem to matter as much anymore. They had found some warmth inside the diner, and for the first time in days, both of them felt a little lighter. Jake felt a quiet satisfaction watching Lily sip her hot chocolate, her eyes reflecting the comfort of a simple moment. It was a small thing, but for a child who had already seen too much, it was everything. As they walked back to the bike, Jake noticed the way Lily hesitated before climbing onto the seat. She was still wary, still unsure about this strange man who had come into her life out of nowhere. He couldn't blame her. She had every right to be afraid. But as she climbed on, her small hands gripping the sides of the bike, Jake realized just how much she had begun to trust him. It was a fragile trust, one that had been born from his actions, not words. They started the bike, the engine roaring to life, and as they rode through the town, Jake found his mind wandering again. He was supposed to be leaving the past behind, but it followed him like a shadow. The Hells Angels, the violence, the regrets. But now, with Lily in his life, it felt different. She had given him a reason to fight, a reason to do more than just survive. He wasn't sure what that meant yet, but it was something worth finding out. As they drove down the empty highway, the world around them seemed to fall away. Jake could feel the rhythm of the road beneath him, the steady beat of the engine, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was heading somewhere. It wasn't just about the destination, it was about the journey, and for once, he didn't feel like he was running from something. Lily's quiet voice broke through his thoughts. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice small but full of curiosity. Jake glanced over his shoulder at her, meeting her eyes. "I don't know yet, kid," he said, his voice steady. "But we're going to find somewhere safe. Somewhere you can stay." He didn't know if it was the right thing to say, but it felt like the right answer. They continued driving through the darkened streets, passing through small towns and empty stretches of road. Jake didn't have a plan, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her. They eventually reached a small town on the outskirts of the state. It was quiet, almost eerily so, with a few scattered homes and an old motel at the edge of the road. Jake pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine. The place was nothing fancy, but it would do. He helped Lily off the bike and led her into the motel. The air inside was stale, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. It wasn't the best place to stay, but it was a roof over their heads. The clerk behind the counter didn't ask any questions as Jake paid for a room. He didn't have to. They were just passing through, and he didn't plan on staying long. He just needed somewhere to rest, somewhere to think. The room was small, with 2 beds and a worn-out couch. Jake set down his bag and turned to Lily. She was standing by the window, looking out into the night, her face reflecting a quiet sadness. He could see it in her eyes, the weight of everything she had lost. She wasn't just scared. She was lost, and he wasn't sure how to fix that. But he wasn't going to give up on her. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. Come on, Jake said, his voice softer than usual. Let's get some rest. We'll figure things out tomorrow. Lily turned to look at him, her eyes still full of uncertainty. But she nodded, walking over to the bed and sitting down. Jake sat down across from her, watching her carefully. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do next. But he knew one thing. He wasn't walking away. Not now. Not ever. As he lay down on the bed, Jake stared at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. He had been running for so long. But now, for the first time in years, he had something worth fighting for. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about making a difference. For Lily. For himself. The road ahead was still unclear, but as he drifted off to sleep, a small part of him believed that maybe, just maybe, they could both rise again. The next morning, Jake woke up early, the sun barely starting to break through the clouds. He sat up in bed, rubbing his eyes and stretching, his body aching from the long ride and the restless sleep. Lily was still asleep in the bed across from him, curled up under the covers, looking smaller than ever. Jake stood up, careful not to wake her, and walked over to the window. The snow had stopped falling, and the town outside seemed frozen in time, the streets empty and quiet. Jake didn't know what they were doing here or where they would go next. But for the first time in a long time, he felt the pull of something different. He wasn't just surviving. He was taking care of someone else, and that felt like a responsibility he wasn't sure he was ready for. But he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. He glanced back at Lily, still fast asleep. He didn't want to wake her up yet. She needed the rest. He had seen how her small frame had tensed whenever he moved, her eyes darting around the room, as though she were still waiting for something bad to happen. Jake could only imagine what she had gone through. But he wasn't going to let her face it alone. As the morning light slowly filled the room, Jake made up his mind. They needed to leave the motel, to get away from the quiet isolation of this place. Lily needed a sense of normalcy again, something that would make her feel safe. But that would have to wait. Jake wasn't sure what the next step was, but he knew they couldn't stay here forever. After a while, Lily stirred, blinking awake as the sunlight touched her face. She looked at Jake with sleepy eyes, unsure of where she was for a moment. "Morning," Jake said softly, smiling. "How are you feeling?" She didn't answer right away, just sat up slowly, pulling the covers around her. She looked out the window, her eyes scanning the quiet town. "I don't know," she said after a long pause. "I don't feel scared here, but I don't know where we're going, either." Jake could feel the weight of her words. He wasn't sure where they were going either, but he couldn't let that stop him. "We're going to find a place for you," he said, his voice steady. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere you can stay." Lily looked at him, her brow furrowed. "But what about you?" she asked. "Where will you stay?" Jake's heart clenched at the question. He had spent so many years alone, and the idea of someone worrying about him was both new and strange. "I'll figure it out," he said, trying to sound confident, even though he had no idea how he was going to make that work. "I just need to make sure you're okay." Lily nodded, though there was still a trace of doubt in her eyes. Jake stood up, pulling on his jacket. "Let's get going," he said. "We'll figure it out together." They packed up their things, Jake gathering his gear while Lily packed her few belongings. It was a strange feeling, knowing that she was relying on him, but it was a responsibility he was beginning to take seriously. Once they were ready, Jake led her outside, the cold air hitting them both as they stepped out into the morning. The bike was still parked outside, the engine cold but ready to go. Jake handed Lily a helmet and helped her onto the back of the bike, securing her before climbing on himself. As they drove away from the motel, Jake couldn't help but wonder what would come next. The road ahead was unknown, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just riding to escape anymore. He was riding to protect, to help, and maybe even to heal. The town slowly disappeared behind them, and Jake focused on the road ahead. He didn't know where it would take them, but he knew that for as long as Lily was with him, he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. They rode through the day, stopping only for gas and food. Jake could feel the tension in Lily's body easing as they moved, her grip on his waist becoming less tight. She was starting to trust him again, and that was something Jake had to hold on to. They couldn't stay in this temporary place forever, but for now, it was enough. As they rode into the sunset, Jake made a silent promise to himself. He would do whatever it took to make sure Lily had a chance at a life she deserved. And in the process, maybe he would find the chance to rebuild his own life too. The next morning, the cold air bit at Jake's face as he woke up to the sound of the wind whistling outside the small motel room. It was a typical morning for him, but for Lily, it was another new start in a life that had been anything but predictable. Jake glanced over at her as she sat up in bed, her eyes still heavy with sleep, but showing a quiet strength that only a child who had been through too much could have. She had changed in the last few days, slowly starting to open up to him in ways that made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the only one struggling with their past. He got up and stretched, trying to shake off the weariness in his bones. The road ahead was still unknown, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to leave her behind. Not now. Not after everything. After a few moments, Jake grabbed his jacket and made his way outside. The weather was cold, but not unbearable. It wasn't snowing anymore, but the sky was overcast, and the clouds were heavy with the promise of more rain. He knew they couldn't stay in this place forever. The little town they had stopped in was small and isolated, and there were only so many places to hide. But for now, it was as good a place as any to lay low for a while. He wasn't sure what their next move was, but it was better to think ahead than stay stuck. He looked back toward the room, where Lily was still getting ready. He gave her a few minutes before he went inside. He wasn't good at this, taking care of someone. But with Lily, it felt different. It was like there was something in him that had been dormant for so long, and now it was finally coming back to life. He couldn't explain it, but he knew he had to keep going. Lily came out of the room a few minutes later, her eyes still tired but determined. She walked over to him, standing next to the bike, waiting for him to make the first move. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Jake didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure where they were going next, but he did know that he couldn't let her down. "We'll find somewhere safe," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "Somewhere you can stay. Somewhere you can rest." She nodded, though her expression remained uncertain. She didn't know if she could trust him yet, but she didn't have anyone else to turn to. And Jake wasn't going to give up on her. He helped her onto the bike, and they set off, the engine roaring as they left the small town behind. They drove for miles, the landscape changing from empty fields to dense woods, the road stretching on as far as Jake could see. The weight of the silence between them was heavy, but Jake didn't mind. He wasn't the type to talk much anyway. The miles passed, and Lily seemed to grow more at ease, her grip on him loosening as she began to relax. Jake could see the tension leaving her small body, but he knew it wasn't over. He had to figure out what came next. They stopped for gas at a small station on the side of the road. The place was old, with cracked windows and a faded sign that looked like it had been there for decades. Jake filled up the tank while Lily went inside to grab some snacks. He watched her through the window, seeing how she interacted with the cashier, quiet but polite, a little shy, but trying. When she came out with a small bag of chips and a bottle of water, Jake couldn't help but notice how much she had changed in the short time they had been together. She wasn't the same frightened little girl he had found by the cabin. She was stronger now, more confident. And maybe, just maybe, so was he. They got back on the road, the engine of the bike humming beneath them as they continued to drive. Jake didn't know where they were going, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a purpose. He wasn't running anymore. He was living for something greater than himself. For Lily. And that was something worth fighting for. As the miles stretched on, Jake couldn't help but think about the road ahead. It wasn't going to be easy. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to face it alone. They would do it together. And that was enough for now. The road stretched ahead, winding through the dense forest as Jake and Lily rode in silence. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees, but it didn't seem to bother either of them. Jake could feel the little girl's small hands gripping him from behind, her body pressed against his back. She had grown quieter over the past few days, but Jake could tell she was still thinking about the past, still processing everything that had happened. The night they had spent in the small motel was the first time Lily had really slept without waking up in fear. She hadn't said much, but Jake had noticed the way her shoulders had relaxed, the tension that had been there since he found her by the cabin easing little by little. They had been on the road for hours, moving from town to town, not staying anywhere too long. Jake wasn't sure where they were headed, but he knew they couldn't keep running forever. They had to find a place for Lily, a place where she could be safe and start over. As they rode on, Jake began to wonder if he could ever truly outrun his past. The Hells Angels, the life he had left behind, had a way of catching up to him. But for the first time in years, he didn't want to run anymore. He had a purpose now, and her name was Lily. They stopped at a small diner off the highway, the kind of place where the food was simple, but it had the comfort of familiarity. It was empty except for a few locals sitting at the counter, the clinking of plates and cups filling the otherwise quiet room. Jake parked the bike and helped Lily off, making sure she was steady on her feet before they walked inside. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, greeted them with a warm smile. "What can I get you, hon?" she asked, her voice friendly but tired. Jake glanced down at Lily, who had her head down, her hands tucked into her jacket sleeves, as if trying to make herself smaller. "Just 2 coffees," Jake said, his voice gruff but soft. He wasn't in the mood for much more. The waitress nodded and walked away, leaving them alone. They sat down at a booth, and Jake could feel Lily's unease. She hadn't said much since they left the motel, but he could see the way she was watching everyone in the room, her eyes darting nervously to the door every time someone came in or out. Jake wasn't sure what she had been through, but it was clear she was still processing it all. She had been through too much for someone her age. "You okay?" Jake asked, his voice low, his gaze fixed on her. She didn't look up at him immediately, but after a few seconds, she nodded. "I'm fine," she said, her voice small. Jake didn't believe her, but he didn't press. He knew better than to force someone to talk when they weren't ready. A few minutes later, the waitress brought over their coffee. She set the cups down in front of them with a small smile. "Anything else I can get you?" she asked. Jake shook his head, and the waitress left them to their own quiet corner. Jake took a sip of his coffee, letting the warmth seep through him. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "You know," Jake began, breaking the silence, "I'm not really good at this. Taking care of someone, I mean." Lily looked up at him then, her eyes meeting his for the first time since they sat down. "I think you're doing okay," she said quietly, a small smile tugging at her lips. Jake blinked in surprise, unsure of how to respond. "Thanks," he said, his voice rough. He didn't know how to tell her that he wasn't sure he was doing okay himself, that every day felt like a step into the unknown, but he didn't want to let her down. "We'll figure it out," he added, almost more to himself than to her. The rest of the meal passed quietly. They didn't talk much, but the silence was comfortable. Jake wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew they couldn't keep moving from place to place forever. Lily needed stability. She needed a home. Jake didn't know if he could be the one to give that to her, but he was going to try. When they finished their coffee, Jake paid the bill, and they stepped outside into the now dimly lit evening. The cold was setting in again, the wind cutting through them as they made their way back to the bike. Jake helped Lily onto the bike and started the engine. As they pulled out of the diner's parking lot, Jake glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She had her arms wrapped tightly around him again, but this time, her grip felt different. It wasn't fear holding her in place, it was trust. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And that, Jake thought, was all they needed right now. The road stretched out before them, the sun hanging low in the sky as Jake and Lily rode through the quiet town. The engine hummed beneath them, the steady rhythm of it lulling them into a comfortable silence. Jake could feel the tension in Lily's body slowly easing, the grip around his waist not as tight as before. She was starting to trust him more, and that was something Jake wasn't used to. He wasn't a man who got close to anyone, but this little girl had managed to worm her way into his heart in a way that he couldn't explain. He had spent so many years running from his past, but now, as they drove through this small town, it felt like maybe, just maybe, he could stop running. Maybe they could build a new life together. They passed through the heart of the town, a sleepy place where people waved as they passed by, seemingly oblivious to the struggles of the people around them. Jake wasn't sure if they would stay here, but it felt like a good place to stop for a while. As they pulled into a small gas station, Jake noticed a diner across the street. The neon lights buzzed in the evening air, a beacon of warmth and comfort. He parked the bike and turned to Lily. "We'll grab some food and figure out what comes next," Jake said, trying to sound casual, though inside, he was filled with uncertainty. Lily nodded, her eyes scanning the area. She was still quiet, but there was something different in the way she looked at the world now. She wasn't as afraid as she had been when they first met, but she was still cautious, still unsure of what the future would hold. Jake knew that feeling all too well. They walked into the diner, the bell above the door jingling as they entered. The place was small, just a few booths and a counter where the regulars sat. The air smelled like coffee and fried food, the kind of place that felt like it had been around for decades, untouched by time. A waitress with a friendly smile greeted them, her name tag reading Becky. She led them to a booth near the window, and Jake slid into the seat, with Lily sitting across from him. Becky took their drink orders, and while she was gone, Jake watched Lily, trying to gauge what was going on inside her head. "What do you think of this place?" Jake asked softly, his voice low, as if afraid to break the fragile peace that had settled between them. Lily looked around, her eyes lingering on the worn booths and the small, quiet crowd. "It's nice," she said quietly, though Jake could tell that she wasn't fully convinced. The truth was, neither of them had a clear idea of what they were doing or where they would go next. They were both searching for something that would give them a sense of stability, of normalcy. But the road ahead was still uncertain, and Jake knew it wouldn't be easy. Their waitress returned with their drinks, placing a cup of coffee in front of Jake and a small glass of juice for Lily. As she walked away, Jake leaned back in his seat, trying to think. The silence between them was comfortable, but it also weighed heavily on him. He had no plan, no clear path. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to leave Lily. He wasn't going to abandon her like so many others had. "Do you ever think about what you want to do next?" Jake asked, his voice steady. Lily looked up at him, a small frown on her face. "I don't know," she said, her voice small. "I just want to be safe. I want to be somewhere I can be okay." Jake nodded, understanding the words better than she realized. That was what he wanted too. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running away from something. He was trying to move towards something better. The waitress returned with their food, setting down plates of pancakes and eggs in front of them. Jake didn't feel particularly hungry, but he ate anyway, not wanting to make Lily feel awkward. They ate in silence, but there was a sense of quiet understanding between them. Jake knew that this was just the beginning. There was still so much to figure out, but they would do it together. As they finished their meal, Jake paid the bill and stood up, offering his hand to Lily. "Let's go," he said, a small but genuine smile on his face. "We'll find somewhere better. Somewhere you can call home." Lily took his hand, her fingers small and warm in his, and together, they left the diner and stepped back into the uncertain future that lay ahead. But for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like they might just be able to build something real, something worth fighting for. The next few days passed quietly, with Jake and Lily settling into a new routine, though they still hadn't found the permanent place they were hoping for. They kept moving from town to town, staying just long enough to get a meal, some rest, and plan their next step. Despite the uncertainty, there was a sense of calm between them. Jake could feel the change in himself. He had always kept people at arm's length, but now, with Lily, things were different. He found himself thinking less about the road he had left behind and more about the path they could carve together. They were both still trying to heal, but there was hope in the quiet moments. One afternoon, as they stopped at a small gas station on the outskirts of another town, Jake noticed a little girl playing in the nearby park. She looked about Lily's age, laughing as she ran through the swings, her mother sitting nearby, watching her with a smile. Lily stood next to Jake, her eyes fixed on the girl. There was a longing in her gaze, a sadness that Jake couldn't ignore. She had lost so much. She had never known a normal childhood, and now, she was trying to make up for lost time. "Do you want to go play?" Jake asked, his voice soft. Lily hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She let go of his hand and slowly made her way toward the swing set, her eyes still on the little girl. Jake stood at a distance, watching her carefully, making sure she was safe. For the first time in a long time, he let himself relax. It wasn't much, just a moment of peace, but it felt like something worth holding on to. As the sun began to set, they left the park and headed toward the motel they had rented for the night. Jake had spent a lot of time thinking about their future, and though he didn't have all the answers, he knew he had to keep moving forward. He wasn't going to let Lily go back to the life she had escaped from. They would find a home, a place where she could feel safe, where she could finally put down roots. When they arrived at the motel, Jake helped Lily off the bike. She was still a little quiet after the time at the park, but there was a small smile on her face, a hint of something that hadn't been there before. As they checked into the motel, the clerk gave them a warm smile and a key to a room on the second floor. "Here you go," the clerk said, handing Jake the key. "Room 12, just down the hall. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Jake nodded and took the key, then led Lily up the stairs to their room. Inside, the room was small but cozy, with a bed, a small table, and a dresser. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. After a quick dinner, they settled in for the night. Lily, exhausted from the day, quickly fell asleep in the bed. Jake stayed up for a while, staring out the window at the darkening sky. He had come a long way since he had met Lily. He had been lost, running from his past, from the mistakes he had made, but now he had something to fight for. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. He stood up and walked over to the bed, looking down at Lily as she slept peacefully. There was a small smile on her face, the first time in days that she had looked truly content. Jake sat down next to her, running a hand through his hair as he let out a long sigh. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing. He wasn't giving up on her. No matter what, he would keep her safe. They had a long way to go, but they were in this together. He stood up, pulling the blanket up over her as she shifted slightly in her sleep. As he turned off the light and sat back down in the chair by the window, he allowed himself a moment of peace. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges, but tonight, they had this small victory. They were still alive. They were still fighting. And that was enough. The next morning, Jake woke up early, the dim light of the morning creeping through the cracks in the curtains. He stretched his arms above his head, the stiffness in his body reminding him of the long days spent on the road. The air in the room was still, quiet, almost too peaceful. He glanced over at Lily, who was still sleeping soundly, curled up under the blanket. There was something almost serene about her, a calmness that he hadn't seen before. She had been through so much, and yet, in these small moments, she seemed to find peace again. Jake stood up slowly, careful not to wake her, and walked to the small window. The streets outside were empty, the town still wrapped in a blanket of fog from the early morning mist. It was the kind of place where nothing seemed to change, where everything was calm and still. Jake wasn't sure how long they could stay in a place like this, but for now, it felt safe. The world outside might have been full of uncertainty, but inside this room, with Lily by his side, things seemed manageable. Jake knew that wouldn't last forever. Eventually, they would have to move on, but for today, he let himself enjoy the brief moment of peace. As the day began, Jake and Lily set out on their usual routine. They didn't have a destination, but they didn't need one. They spent the morning exploring the town, walking through the streets, and seeing the sights. Jake noticed how Lily was starting to open up more, her steps lighter, her smile a little wider. They stopped at a small cafe, sitting by the window as they ate a quiet breakfast. The waitress was kind, and the place had a warmth that reminded Jake of better days. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this way, like maybe, just maybe, he was starting to get something right. After breakfast, they walked down to the park. It wasn't much, just a few benches and a small playground. But for Lily, it was a world of possibilities. She ran toward the swings with an enthusiasm that made Jake smile. Watching her, he realized that she had begun to act like a kid again. It wasn't perfect, and there were still traces of the fear and sadness she had carried with her. But there was something in her eyes that made Jake believe that she was finding a little piece of happiness again. He stood there, leaning against the tree, watching her swing higher and higher. For a moment, he let himself imagine a future where they weren't running anymore. A future where Lily could go to school, make friends, and just be a child. Jake didn't know how to give her that, but he was going to try. He had to. After a while, Lily ran over to him, breathless and full of energy. "Can we stay here for a while longer?" she asked, her eyes shining with excitement. Jake nodded, a small laugh escaping him. "Sure, kid. We can stay as long as you want." As they sat together on the grass, Lily resting her head on his shoulder, Jake felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He had spent so much time running, so much time focused on the mistakes he had made, but now, for the first time, he realized that maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to build something, to make a home for Lily. That thought was terrifying, but it was also the only thing that felt right. As the sun began to set, they made their way back to the motel. The evening was cool, but not too cold, and the sky was a mix of purple and orange. Lily was quiet as they walked, her hand wrapped around Jake's, her small fingers still finding comfort in his. When they reached the room, Jake could see the tiredness in her eyes. It had been a long day, and tomorrow would bring more uncertainty, but for tonight, they had each other. They had a place to rest. After dinner, Lily climbed into bed and pulled the covers up around her. Jake stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment. He had no idea what the future held, but at that moment, he felt a small glimmer of hope. He wasn't sure how he was going to make everything work, but he wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not when there was still a chance. As he sat down in the chair by the window, Jake allowed himself a small moment of peace. He had come a long way since that night he found Lily by the cabin, and for the first time, he felt like he could finally start building something worth fighting for. With Lily by his side, he knew there was still hope. And that, Jake thought, was enough. The days passed slowly, each one blending into the next as Jake and Lily continued their quiet journey through small towns and back roads. They had made a home of sorts in their constant movement, the rhythm of the road becoming their constant companion. The peacefulness they had found in the small park and motel seemed to have given Lily a new sense of hope, though the road ahead still seemed unclear. Jake knew they couldn't keep running forever. They needed to find a permanent place to stay, a safe haven where Lily could truly begin to heal and build a future. But even as he thought about it, he wasn't sure where to start. For the first time in years, Jake found himself wondering if he could ever truly leave his past behind. He had spent so much time running from it, but now, it felt like it was closing in on him. Every town they passed, every stranger they met, made him wonder if his past would finally catch up with him. As they continued down the road, Jake focused on Lily. He could see how much she had changed since he first found her. She wasn't the same frightened, lost girl she had been. Now, she was more open, more willing to trust, and for the first time in a long time, Jake could see a glimmer of the child she was meant to be. They had spent the day in a quiet town, and by the time the sun began to set, they were back on the road again. Jake was trying to keep his mind on the journey, but his thoughts kept drifting. He had always been someone who kept his distance from people, someone who found comfort in solitude. But now, with Lily by his side, he was starting to realize that he didn't want to be alone anymore. As they rode, the wind whipping around them, Jake felt a sense of connection that he had never felt before. For the first time, he wasn't just living for himself. He was living for Lily. And in some ways, he was living for himself too. The road was still long, and there was still so much to figure out. But in that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. They stopped for the night at a small roadside inn, the kind of place that didn't stand out, but felt like home nonetheless. The innkeeper greeted them warmly, handing over the key to a small room at the end of the hall. Jake and Lily walked to their room, the quiet sound of their footsteps echoing in the hallway. Inside, the room was simple but comfortable. A bed, a small desk, and a window that looked out at the darkening sky. They didn't need much more than that. Lily set her things down and went straight to the bed, pulling the covers up around her. Jake sat at the desk for a moment, lost in thought. The future was still uncertain, but he couldn't deny the feeling that they were getting closer to something. He wasn't sure if it was a place, a home, or just a sense of belonging, but it was something worth fighting for. After a few moments, Jake stood up and walked over to Lily. She was already drifting off to sleep, her small frame curled up in the bed. He smiled softly, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. He reached down and tucked the blanket around her, making sure she was comfortable. He paused for a moment, watching her sleep. She was safe. She was with him. And for the first time, Jake allowed himself to feel like he might be doing something right. He turned off the light and sat back down in the chair by the window. The sound of the wind outside was still there, but inside the room, there was peace. Tomorrow, they would continue their journey, but tonight, they had found a small moment of peace in the chaos. Jake knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that with Lily by his side, he could face whatever came next. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like they were on the right path, a path towards something better. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt like he could face it. He wasn't alone anymore. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains, casting soft shadows on the small room where Jake and Lily had spent the night. The world outside was quiet, the streets still, and the sky just beginning to brighten with the first rays of sunlight. Jake stretched and rubbed his face, the weight of the days spent on the road finally catching up to him. He had always been a man of action, focused on survival, on getting from one day to the next. But now, with Lily, something had shifted. He wasn't just moving through life anymore. He was living it, for the first time in a long time. He glanced over at Lily, still asleep in the bed, her small frame curled up beneath the covers. There was a sense of peace in her expression, a calmness that he hadn't seen when they first met. The girl who had been so afraid, so lost, was beginning to find her way again. And it was because of him. Jake didn't know if he was ready to take on the responsibility of being her protector, her father figure, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to leave her behind. Not now. Not ever. He quietly got out of bed and walked to the window, looking out at the town that had been their home for the last few days. It was a small place, nothing special, but it had given them a sense of safety. Jake knew they couldn't stay here forever, but for now, it felt like the calm before the storm. He didn't know what the future held, but he had to keep moving forward. They had to find something more permanent, a place where Lily could truly start over. The road had been long, but they had made it this far. Jake wasn't about to stop now. He turned back to look at Lily, still asleep, and smiled. She had no idea how much she had already changed his life. She had reminded him of what it meant to care, to fight for someone else. And that was worth everything. He went to the small table in the corner of the room, picking up his phone. He had to make a call. He had a plan now, a loose one, but it was a start. He dialed the number, waiting as the line rang. It was answered on the second ring. "Hello," a voice on the other end said, sounding groggy. "It's Jake," he replied. "We need help. I've got a kid with me. We need a place to stay. Somewhere safe." There was a long pause, and Jake could hear the person on the other end mumbling to themselves. Finally, they spoke. "I know a place. It's not much, but it's secure. I'll help you out." Jake nodded, even though the person couldn't see him. "Thanks," he said simply, hanging up the phone. The decision had been made. They would head out of this small town and toward a new place, one where they could start over. He turned to look at Lily again, watching her sleep for a moment longer before gently waking her. "Hey, kid," he said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Time to go? We've got a new place to check out." Lily groggily opened her eyes, blinking at him for a moment before the events of the last few days seemed to click into place. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. "Where are we going now?" she asked, her voice still small but curious. Jake gave her a reassuring smile. "We're going to a place where we can settle in for good. It's not much, but it'll be home. At least for now." Lily's eyes lit up, and she smiled for the first time in what felt like days. Jake helped her get dressed and packed their things, making sure they didn't leave anything behind. The small room felt emptier as they gathered their bags, but it wasn't just the physical space that had changed. It was them. They had come a long way from the days when Jake had found her on the side of the road, alone and terrified. And now, they were about to take another step forward. They left the motel and headed to the bike. Jake started the engine, the familiar roar of the Harley a comforting sound. Lily climbed on behind him, wrapping her arms around him as she had done so many times before. This time, it felt different. There was a sense of certainty, a feeling that they were finally moving toward something better. They rode out of the town, the sun climbing higher in the sky, the road ahead still long, but full of possibility. Jake didn't know what would come next, but as he glanced over his shoulder at Lily, smiling as she held on tight, he knew one thing. They were going to make it. Together. In these compelling Hell Angels stories, we dive into the life of a rugged biker who finds his purpose in protecting a young girl he discovers in the wilderness. Through hardship and uncertainty, these Hell Angels stories unfold as the biker navigates the challenges of caregiving, redemption, and creating a new life with the girl by his side. The journey is filled with moments of growth and transformation, both for the biker and the child, as they confront their pasts and seek a safer future. As they travel through small towns, the bond between them strengthens, providing hope amidst the unknown. These Hell Angel stories take you on an emotional ride, highlighting the themes of family, trust, and survival, as the biker becomes more than just a protector, but a symbol of resilience. From a chance meeting to a journey that changes both of their lives. This chapter in the Hell Angels stories shows the powerful connection that can form between two lost souls seeking solace. Their story is a testament to the idea that even in the most challenging circumstances, there is always the possibility of a fresh start. As they make their way through a difficult world, the Hell Angels stories remind us that sometimes our greatest strength comes from the bonds we form with others. This final chapter of their journey represents the hope and promise of new beginnings, showing how, through adversity, love and loyalty can heal even the deepest wounds.